Neil was as surprised as anybody. It's like, you want me to join Fleetwood Mac? I think he put out a tweet saying, the mysteries of Stonehenge have been resolved. Oh, and I've joined Fleetwood Mac. It's like this really bizarre tweet. People are like, what?
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, you can find every episode there along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. Jeff Apter is a returning guest. His latest book is called Don't Dream It's Over, The Remarkable Life of Neil Finn. Don't Dream It's Over is the first biography to focus exclusively on Neil Finn, the man who wrote the timeless hits of Split Enz and Crowded House. In February 1980, 21-year-old Neil Mullane Finn penned the hit song I Got You for Kiwi band Split Enz, co-founded by his older brother Tim. Over 5 decades, Neil created multiple hits for Split Enz, his band Crowded House, and as a solo artist, including Don't Dream It's Over, Better Be Home Soon, One Step Ahead, and Into Temptation. In 2018, he added one more impressive gig to his resume by joining Fleetwood Mac. Despite his success, Neil faced various challenges. He's had conflicts with his brother Tim and had to cope with the tragic death of Crowded House bandmate Paul Hester. He had tough early days with Split Enz in England, surviving on welfare. With a Catholic upbringing and a 40-year-long marriage to his wife Sharon, Neil's life has not been easy. Yet his story remains one of the most inspiring musical sagas in recent history. It's all covered here in Jeff's new book, and he'll tell us all about it in this episode. A playlist of Neil Finn's music can be found on the show notes page. Jeff Apter, you are now officially a returning guest on the Booked on Rock podcast. What's up?
I'm a sequel. Yeah.
I didn't scare you away.
Don't call it a comeback.
Today we want to focus on the brand new book you have on Neil Finn, Don't Dream It's Over. And here in the U.S., because we were talking to you and you were in Australia, right? Here in the U.S., I would say we know Neil mostly for his work with Crowded House. I mean, he had huge hits here. Don't Dream It's Over, Something So Strong, Better Be Home Soon. There was one Split Enz song, I Got You, that was a hit in the U.S. But where you are, he's huge. Like you right here, Neil is the most successful singer-songwriter of his generation in the New Zealand, Australia area. You first saw him in 1979, winter of 79. Can you share with us that experience?
Oh, it was a real big moment for me as a fan, not a music writer. It was well before I got started in this sort of dodgy line of work. I was 17, I was underage, and there was a big show in Australia in the 70s and 80s called Countdown. It was basically a knockoff of a British show called Top of the Pops. It was, mimed performances in the studio, and then at the end, the show would end with the top 10 countdown of that week. But it was great. What it really achieved was exposing, if you're a band in, say, Perth, which is this far-flung Australian capital city, way over on the west coast, 5 hours from anywhere, you could be a band in Perth, and suddenly people in Sydney know about you because they saw you on Countdown. So it really exposed people in a way that had never really been done before here. Split Enz were a real favorite on Countdown because they looked great. This is a period where they're wearing the matching suits. They've got the crazy mohawks. They've got makeup piled on their face. They're playing these really quirky, offbeat, almost like cabaret type music. But Neil had joined the band a couple of years before and sort of changed the focus of the band. His big brother Tim was the leader and the co-founder of Split Enz, but he invited Neil in under duress. Their guitarist had quit in the middle of in the middle of a UK tour, and they needed someone. And Neil was the only one who knew their songs because he was a huge fan, absolutely in awe of what his big brother had achieved. Joined the band anyway. So it's 1979, and there's still sort of a cult act. They'd had one minor hit with I See Red, which you might be familiar with. Yep. They got exposure on the show Countdown. They've been playing a lot. They've been in Australia for a couple of years, alternating between here and the UK, making a mark for themselves, but still sort of a cult university type act. But when I saw them, there was only maybe 100 people in the audience. It was a midweek. It was cold. It was winter. it wasn't very well promoted show. It was in a disco of all places, in between the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and a spinning mirror ball.
Oh, the spinning mirror ball.
Oh, man. And it actually had one of those illuminated dance floors as well. It was really quite the joint.
Wow.
But you could just see something was about to happen with this band. I'm sure you've had the same experience, Eric, when you see a group and you just go, something's about to give. It could be for better usually, but sometimes they're about to, implode. In the case of Split Enz, you could really tell. Got this real sense, even though I was just a kid and a fan, just a kid off the street watching music on TV and in the pubs. You just tell something was about to give. Something was really about to happen. They were great on stage. They had a lot of energy, and they were playing new songs that none of us had heard. But within 6 months, it was number one. I Got You was number one. The album True Colors was number one. They were all over the radio, all over the television, playing really big venues. They just exploded. And a lot of that was due, although Neil would downplay it, I think a lot of that was due to his presence. He was younger than the other guys in the band. He was kind of classically good looking. He could have been a fifth Beatle, whereas the others, they're a really odd bunch and willing to amplify their oddness, if that makes sense. Whereas Neil was more of a, even though he wore kooky glasses and had the makeup on and did crazy things with his hair, he was still a good-looking guy, young guy, who'd step out the front of the band occasionally to play his own songs. And women loved him. There was a lot of screaming going on, even though it was a small crowd. And I just remember walking away thinking, wow, something's going to happen to this band. They really felt like they were on the verge of something. And like I say, within 6 months, and it wasn't just in Australia, as you said, they had huge success in Canada. I Got You was a hit in America. It was a top 10 hit in the UK. And it really broke them as an international band.
Good timing, because the MTV era kicks in and you got to have looks for MTV.
They were a perfect match. Yeah, and they were really video savvy too. If you trail back through, their early career, they were called film clips then, but they invested themselves in making interesting, and they were naturally odd. They were all art school students, so they were naturally odd by nature. And some of their early video clips are fantastic. They're really funny and quirky and completely unpredictable and really sort of captured the nature of the band really, really well. So I think they really utilized that, what was then, really a nascent format video. I think they really took advantage of that. And they, like you say, they suited the MTV generation perfectly.
Neil had an interesting relationship with Tim. It was like there was some competition there. He also emulated him, though. He looked up to him, but then there was also like, if Tim did well, Neil wanted to do better.
The sibling thing, it's a classic rock and roll story, isn't it? The Davies brothers and the Kinks, the Gallaghers in Oasis, the Everly brothers, for God's sake. It's an ongoing complication that, and I always think about the Everlys because what Neil and Tim could do was something that Don and Phil Everly could do too, which was sing beautifully in harmony. Their voices really chimed together because as kids, they sang a lot together at the family home, on holidays. It's an interesting background because it's sort of un-rock and roll. They're very middle class. The dad was an accountant. Their parents wanted them to follow the faith and become Catholic priests. They'd spend a lot of their holidays actually with this Catholic priest called the Durning brothers, who really taught Neil and Tim how to sing in harmony. There was no drugs, no drama, not until Tim went to university anyway. And they were really raised in a very sensible, quite sleepy middle-class town called Te Awamutu, which Neil went on to mention in the song. And Neil said that it was a very good place to grow up, but it was so quiet that people would walk miles to see a man's collection of sticks. It was that kind of place. And I went there, and actually I remember I didn't see it. Well, someone said, "Oh, have you been there?" And I said, "Well, I sort of drove through it." Because it's really small.
Is it? Yeah.
It's a signpost and a few houses and a little collection of shops, and that's it. But of course, to come to Australia was the big thing for New Zealand bands at that time. But then to actually progress from there to become a household name in America and all around the world, that's a huge achievement.
Well, I love the prologue. It sets the scene of that day when the phone call comes in. Neil gets the call from Tim, and he makes Tim suffer a little bit. Because Tim's thinking, it's like, hey, we want you in the band. And he's thinking Neil's going to be like, yeah, right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, but he made him wait like a couple hours or something.
Yeah. It's 1977. The situation is Split Enz are in the UK. They've got a big booster of the band was Phil Manzanera, the guitarist from Roxy Music. He really loved the band. He produced some of their early records and he encouraged them to come to the UK. And this is around the time of punk. And while they weren't a punk band, they sort of fitted with the aesthetic. You know, there was mohawks. There was sort of they looked angry on stage. They were quite a physical band on stage. And there's, you know, I get into it in the book where punks have this very serious discussion about whether they fitted or not. You know, Susie from Susie and the Banshees was a big Split Enz fan. You know, she'd sit on the edge of the stage. This is back in the 70s, just looking at them, I think trying to work out, are they punk?
Are they punk?
Punk?
Yeah.
Are they punk? Do they fit? So anyway, there've been problems with Mike Shunn, who was one of the co-founders of the band, and Phil Judd, and they've been in and out of the band. And like I said earlier, Neil knew their music inside out. He went to their first gig. He was 12 years old when he first saw Split Enz. You know, he followed them whenever they played in New Zealand. He'd be at the shows. He had a, you know, photographic memory about their songs, the lyrics. He jammed with them. He really understood their music inside and out. But at the same time, he's got his own band going, a group called After Hours, which was the first band he ever formed, you know, and they were about to go in and do some recordings. So when Neil got the call from Tim, you know, this SOS call, come and join my band in England, Neil was torn. You know, he said, oh, damn, yeah, we're about to go and make our first record. Something could really happen with my band. But then he sort of weighed it up and went, well, I love Split Enz. You know, it's my brother's band. I know all their material and they're in London and I'm, 18 years old. You know, it was such a huge adventure that he couldn't say no. I think After Hours eventually went in and recorded that. And of course, those couple of recordings, they may become quite collector's items because the band folded immediately afterwards. But it is interesting when you look at Neil's career. He's only been in a few bands. He had After Hours, then he went to Split Enz, then he went to Crowded House. And recently he's been playing in some bigger band called Fleetwood something.
I heard of it. Yeah, my gosh, I got to ask you about that.
I don't know who they are.
Wow.
You know, Pretenders.
Yeah, that is such a great story too. We got to get to that. But I love the songwriting between Neil and Tim. They're in the same flat, but they're in separate parts of the flat. So Neil's upstairs, Tim's downstairs, and they'd shout out titles to each other, sounding.
This is the whole weird brothers thing, isn't it? You know, they're sort of creative rivals almost in the band, because Neil gradually over the next, you know, he joined in 77, but it really wasn't until 1980 with True Colours that his songs were prominent in the band's recording and performing setup. You know, there'd been some resistance. In fact, when he first joined Split Enz, he couldn't play electric guitar. He could only play acoustic guitar. And when he came over to the UK, the first thing they did was get him some lessons with Phil Manzanera, who's like this ace guitarist. So, you know, he really fell into a very lucky situation. But yeah, there was always a certain resistance. I think the guys in the band were a little bit older than Neil. He was still really an apprentice. You know, when Neil started out with Split Enz, when he went over and joined the band, he was sandwich boy, they used to call him, when they'd be rehearsing. And, you know, it'd be lunchtime, they'd be rehearsing and they'd all go, well, pretty hungry. Neil, you're the youngest one here. Can you go down the shop? You know, and off he'd have to go down and get the sandwiches. But of course, you know, as the years progressed, he'd come back with sandwiches and the draft of I Got You. You know, it's like, yeah, the sandwiches are good, Neil. That song's got some potential.
Yeah, huge hit. But he had problems with that song in the video, right? What were the...
he hated it. Yeah. You see the video, the camera, because he wanted to be one of the band. He didn't want to be the focal point of his brother's band. And this is where it gets complicated. You know, he always knew all along that it was Tim's band. It wasn't Neil's band. But he was gradually becoming the star. You know, with that success of I Got You and True Colours and some of the singles that followed that, Neil very much became the center point. You know, they played shows and, you know, Tim would be singing songs that everybody knew. It was great. Neil would come on and suddenly there'd be screaming and shrieks. There was graffiti in Melbourne that said, I crave for Neil's Finn, which they'd never had that kind of teen worship before. And it sat very uncomfortably with Neil.
Sure.
Neil got married in his early 20s, you know, and is still married to Sharon, 40 years down the line. He craved a normal, you know, sort of normality away from this career in music. But he was getting chased through, you know, he was having hard days night kind of experiences when he went to buy some groceries, you know, be chased through the store by teenage girls and things like this, which is not what he wanted not what he joined the band to achieve. That was never on his radar.
Makes it double difficult for him because it's not something he asked for. So now he's got his
yeah.
brothers ticked off at him, and he's also like, I don't want all this attention. I'd rather just.
Well, it's such a divided thing, isn't it? You know, Tim at the same time was great that Split Enz were getting all this attention and were having success and selling records, and actually for once, for the first time in their life, making money.
I was just saying, money's coming in, yeah.
Well. But a lot of it was on the success of Neil's songs. So, and Neil felt comfortable about that. The Catholic guys, you know, they're raised Catholic. They did guilt from head to toe.
Catholic guilt.
They could have been accountants and still felt guilty about it, you know. But you know, it certainly caused a lot of complications. But at the same time, you know, got the band that attention and that success that they probably never would have achieved if Neil hadn't joined the band.
Yeah. What's the story about Neil and Herb Alpert? Do you remember this? It's in the book.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's weird. He had a dream, and I'm trying to recall. Did he dream that Herb spoke to him, or Herb had died, or something terrible had happened? And then years later, he found with Crowded House, suddenly he's in Herb Alpert's studio.
Yes. So, you know, the dream, I think, was that Herb, in the dream, he wanted to sign Neil to his label, I think.
Yeah, A&M. Had an instrumental hit called with the Tijuana Brass. Was it The Spanish Flea? The Spanish Flea.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
So he had this solo career, but then, he set up A&M with Jerry Moss. It was a huge label and studio. And suddenly Neil's recording in the studio, this guy that he dreamed about years before. So, you know, he had all these kind of odd, you've got to understand too, coming from this end of the world, you know, I'm a very proud Australian, and I think we punch above our weight, if that makes sense. You know, we achieve really great things in arts and sport and all kinds of areas, but there's still a little chip on our shoulders. And to come from New Zealand, it's a lot like to an American coming from Canada. There's that kind of situation as well. It's a little harder still to break through. You know, a New Zealander like Neil has to crack Australia before you'd even think about going to America. So there's always this little bit of baggage. There's always this little, am I good enough? Am I good enough? And it's just I guess it's just when you're raised on Western culture, in particular American culture, and you see that as the ideal. Yeah, it's pretty tricky when suddenly you're part of it, you know, and you have to go, yes, you know, what's the best way to succeed in America? Be bold, be you know, confident. But in Australia and New Zealand, that's frowned on a little bit. We have something here called the tall poppy syndrome. And it means that if you get a little bit too big for your boots, we like to cut you down very quickly. You know, just bring you back to earth. Yes, you've had a #1 song, but, you know, you still got to get up and get the groceries, don't you? You know, no one makes your coffee for you, and you have to remind people of that.
So Crowded House, they weren't called that at first. What was their initial band name?
They were called the Mullanes, which is Neil's middle name, because they were, what had happened is Neil had taken Tim's advice. He started something with Paul Hester. Nick Seymour, classic. He was a pretty good operator. He'd muscled his way in. The last night that Split Enz played in Australia, Nick, he was sort of hanging around the edges of the scene at that time. He was a musician, but he wasn't in a big band or anything, and he wanted to work with Neil. And Neil was paralytically drunk, and Nick offered to drive him home. And on the drive home, he'd convinced Neil to let him audition for the band. Of course, Neil forgot all about it the next day. He was too busy throwing up. But Nick didn't forget. You know, he sort of maneuvered his way into the band, and it turned out to be a great thing. There was another guy called Craig Hooper who played in a local band called The Reels. They weren't really sure what they were. You know, they were still kicking around early songs like Something So Strong. Don't Dream It's Over was way off in the future. And they went out and did a tour here, and they booked basically on the strength of having Neil Finn. It's Neil Finn's new band, but they had no name. So Neil just went, oh, no, the Mullanes, that'll do. And they did a tour under that name. And I'm not sure. I think they might have done some demo recordings, but, you know, really by the time they got a record deal, and this is quite an interesting story. Typically in Australia, you record for the local version of Sony or Universal or EMI or whatever it is. And then the Australian branch will take your successful record and off they go to America, hoping to sell it to the mothership, you know. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, the American label rejects, and you're sort of stuck trying to find a label that's going to distribute your record overseas. In the case of Crowded House, Neil had been through that experience with Split Enz and said, bugger that, I'm not going to do it. So they'd recorded a series of really good demos, and he went to America and shopped it and actually got a deal with Capitol, which, you know, was the Beatles label in America. It was the Beach Boys label, you know, so bingo, you know, he hit the jackpot. A lot of it on the strength of what he'd done with with Split Enz, but it was a really very savvy move. Again, probably not what you'd expect from a typical rock and roller. He's this guy with good business head too. He just went, okay, I don't want to record for my little Australian label and hope someone in America is going to pick it up. I'm going to the States and I'm going to sell it. He basically hit the pavement, and with his demo, and got lucky, found a supporter in Capital, got connected with Mitchell Froome, and the pieces came together really beautifully on that first Crowded House record.
In Crowded House, isn't that a reference, I think you mentioned in the book, to him living in the flat with his brother and all the guys?
Yeah.
Like everybody was like on top of each other?
They're in LA. Yeah, they're making the first record. So he's got the deal, and they still don't really have a, it's still Neil Finn's band. And Neil and Paul Hester were more homebodies. They'd stay at home, smoke a little pot, work on their record, whereas Nick Seymour was a party animal. So he's bringing people home. He's going into LA and he's going to warehouse parties and he's bringing all these people home. And I think Neil said it was like living in the house that the Monkees lived in their TV show. And just the name Crowded House just came to him.
That's
and
great.
It fitted perfectly. Yeah. And,
That's great.
It's proved to be this great vehicle for Neil, almost 40 years later.
And, whenever I hear Don't Dream It's Over, that riff is timeless. That song is timeless, but just that riff is just so crisp, and it runs throughout that whole song. It's just perfect. Tell me about this one.
There's two.
So many pieces of trivia in the book that you have on this.
Well, there's two crucial melodies, I guess, to that. There's that opening guitar strum. Now they call that the Kiwi campfire strum. Okay.
Yeah.
In New Zealand, the indigenous people are Maori. And they're a very musical race, really great singers. They love things like country music, and they'll sit at a campfire with someone who have an acoustic guitar, and suddenly 20 people are singing in harmony. Really beautiful voices. So as a New Zealander, Neil's exposed to that. And a lot of that is not just the singing, but also the playing. That really simple but really melodic guitar style. So that opens the song perfect. The Kiwi campfire strum. They're in the studio. Mitchell Froome has come on, and he's really virtually a first-time producer, but a guy who's always been in and around the scene and wanted to produce a new band. So he's connected. Him and Neil have found that they got on really well. And I think Mitchell went away with the demo of Don't Dream It's Over and came back and said, I've got an idea for the instrumental passage in the middle. And it was a keyboard solo, sort of loosely inspired by the keyboard on Whiter Shade of Pale, the Procol Harum song. And if you listen to it, it's in the same kind of, certainly not plagiaristic in any way, but it captures a similar kind of mood. It's not an obvious instrumental solo. It's sort of moodier, a bit calmer. I don't know. It's something, and it just fits the mood of that song perfectly. So now we've got the Kiwi campfire strum, and we've got the Whiter Shade of Pale organ solo, and those pieces just fitted together perfectly. They did a great video for it. The performances are really good. Everything about the song was just perfect.
Oh, it's perfect. The tone,
right song, right
the
time,
tone of the guitar. Now, there's a couple lyrical nods, one to the Beatles, but then also Building a Wall Between Us. That has to do with his Split Enz days. Wasn't that lyric? I think about them being to somebody, some mention of. We could look it up. Building a Wall Between Us.
Well, he was always, casting his mind back. When he It's interesting. If you look at Neil's career, he's always gone back to a band. Okay, he's had periods as a solo artist. And in fact, he ended Crowded House to become a solo act, and then realized pretty quickly that he just enjoyed it's not just the playing, but it's the camaraderie of a band. He really, really enjoyed. When he was asked, and I documented in the book, what are your best memories of Split Enz? He said, it's on the bus. It's in a hotel somewhere playing games of snooker, while having a drink. It's when you talk about, you get this from sports people too. When they look back on their careers, they don't go, oh, it was the time I hit that winning home run or something. Often you'll get, it's the time in the locker room. It's just hanging out with these people. It's the relationships you form with them. And I think Neil really missed that from Split Enz and was trying to replicate it in Crowded House. But it did get complicated because suddenly he's in charge. Like I said, Split Enz was always Tim's band. Neil wasn't calling the shots, but now in Crowded House, he's the chief cook and bottle washer.
Pressure.
He's writing the songs. He's out front of the band. He's the prominent guy in the videos. He's involved with management and record label and all that stuff. And it's sort of over time created a bit of a buffer between him and the other guys. It wasn't until years later when Paul Hester, post Crowded House, he started his own band, a little band in Melbourne. And he went, oh my God, now I understand what Tim, because he had to corral all the members. Right, we've got to be at rehearsal at 10:30. The gig's on at 9. We need to load in at 7, all those things. He never had to do that in Crowded House because it was Neil's responsibility.
Yep.
Right. And Paul
More
said,
pressure.
He said, oh my God, if I'd known then what I know now, I would never have behaved the way I did, And he sent out a public apology to Neil. I'm so sorry, man, for everything that I did in Crowded House, because he was the guy that always slept in. He's the guy that always missed the bus, and ultimately, of course, Paul's the great tragedy of not just Crowded House, but Neil's life story as well.
Yeah. Here's the part of the book that you write. Let's see. The lyric about building a wall between us. He didn't want to mix with the people visiting Tim's house as he worked on the songs.
Oh, sorry about the creation of the song. That's right. Yeah. He was at Tim's house, and there was a bit of a party going on, and he just said, "Oh man, I'm not in that mood. I'm just not in the mood for that."
Yeah.
And he went away and just started tinkering on the piano.
And
that's where Don't Dream It's Over evolved from.
And that's
Neil now. Sorry.
That's Neil. and the other one, though, was the reference to the Beatles, the paper cup reference.
Yeah. Because
Right?
his favorite song was Across the Universe.
Yes.
Yeah. So, there's all these little moments. And like I said before, in one of the Crowded House songs, Neil talks about the sound of Te Awa Mutu had a truly sacred ring, and that's his old hometown.
Cool.
So there's all these little cues and clues that he drops into his lyrics, which I really, really like.
Yeah.
Which helps, particularly as a biographer, helps you piece together the fragments of someone's life. Because, unfortunately, I couldn't get him involved with the book because, like I said, he was busy with this band called, I keep getting the name wrong, Big Mac or something, Fleetwood Burger.
Yes.
What are they called? I don't know.
They've been around for a while.
I mean, I wish them well in the future. They might have a career. I don't know.
They were an old British blues band, I think. The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. The book is called Don't Dream It's Over, The Remarkable Life of Neil Finn. Jeff Apter is the author. What influence did the producer have, Mitchell Froome, on something so strong? Because it started off more folky, right?
Yeah, well, look, not just there, but on a lot. Like I said, with Don't Dream It's Over, he brought in that keyboard solo, the organ solo that really became a big part of the song. You have to understand with Mitchell Froome, he, like I say, he wasn't by any means an apprentice, or he'd had some experience, but this was the first major label band that he'd be given sole producer credit for, and he was as ambitious for this to succeed as Neil was. This was Neil's first big band. He had his deal. So I think his input, particularly on that first record, maybe on the first couple of records, was really, really paramount. It was like he was a fourth member of Crowded House. He'd bring in musical ideas. He'd bring in structural ideas, arrangement ideas. And of course, the beautiful part of that story is that here we are in, 2024. And a few years ago, Mitchell joins the band.
Yeah.
I mean, how perfect is that?
Yeah, that's cool.
He'd worked on them, and he'd really worked on their most successful and popular material. And years down the line, and always been involved with Neil on a personal and professional level. And then years later, he brings him in. You join the band. There's something really quite beautiful. The Beatles never got George Martin to join that would have been nice.
Yeah,
little piano, George. But Mitchell Froome now he's a working, paid up, card-carrying member of Crowded House.
Wow. Do you know if there's a demo of the original version? Was it more folky? Of something so strong?
There's a lot of stuff exists out there, a lot of bootleg material and raw stuff that I've had access to. And the evolution of a lot of his songs is really interesting. And Neil talks about this a lot. He did a sort of a podcast called Fang Radio, Fang Radio, where he'd talk about individual albums and songs, particularly of Crowded House. He'd get Nick Seymour in occasionally, or he'd get Mitchell Froome in, or he'd get Brother Tim in to talk about it. And it's fascinating stuff. And often he'll play the different versions of these songs.
Oh, that's cool. I'd love to hear it.
It is really interesting to hear how things evolve and can change shape quite considerably. But, Neil always, I think, was always very open to that kind of possibility. Not unlike the Beatles, who for him were the touchstone. There was a band that when you listen to, particularly the what's it called, the anthology series.
Yep.
You'd hear these songs in these very raw versions, and you think, how did that become a day in the life? And things like that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that stuff there. And Mitchell Froome, going back to Mitchell Froome, absolutely, the fourth member, and now I think he's hang on, how many is in the band now? I think he's about the sixth member.
Yeah.
But a permanent fixture now in Crowded House. Whatever they do in the future, it's pretty much assured that he's going to be part of it.
Yeah. I didn't mention this we got to mention that Don't Dream It's Over, the UK label EMI thought it had no legs. That was the quote.
Beatlesy.
No legs. Too Beatlesque.
Too Beatlesque. Can you imagine? How is that a criticism?
Number 2 in the US, number 1 in New Zealand.
That's too Beatlesque. Don't do that. That's rubbish. Why would you want to make a song sound like the Beatles?
Unbelievable.
But of course it was a bigger hit in America than it was in the UK. There's the great story that it was beaten to the top of the charts by George Michael and Aretha Franklin. I think it's that I Knew You Were Waiting For Me. And Neil said that he knew it was never going to get to number 1 because as the song is climbing the charts, they're in a private plane going to a gig, and there's trouble, there's turbulence. The plane almost crashes. They finally land. They're, oh, thank God, we made it. And then Neil got arrested because he looked like a guy who'd just done a bank job. And he said,
oh my God,
complete mistaken identity. It was cleared up quite quickly, but he said, that's it. I know the gods are not favoring me. I know it's not going to be number 1, but still, number 2 in America was a huge achievement and something that was really recognized here as a massive achievement.
But what happened? So the next album, though, they follow up that self-titled debut. That was 1986. 1988, Temple of Low Men.
Temple of Low Men, yeah.
And they got 3 singles, Mean to Me, World Where You Live, and Now We're Getting Somewhere. But they all failed to connect with American radio audiences, although in Australia they charted. But why was that? Like what? It's like U.S. fans just all of a sudden decided they weren't interested in it.
It's one of those inexplicables, isn't it? It's just one of those mysteries.
So so it wasn't like a marketing mistake. Maybe they didn't do enough to
no, I mean, there was a big issue with the third record, with Woodface. In the US, they released Chocolate Cake as the first single, and that's an American bashing song. It's funny and it's quirky, but it's really having a dig at America.
Yeah.
Which is not the easiest way to reintroduce yourself to a musical market by saying, hey, let me show you all your flaws. They were, as you say, they're always successful in Australia. The records always sold hugely here. They won all the awards and accolades. They toured to the biggest venues we have. But in America, things got a little weird. And also there's sort of the curse of distance too. I think about guys like, I've written about Keith Urban. The Bee Gees are another example. Helen Reddy, people who, Australian-based artists, don't get me started. People are going to say, but the Bee Gees are from England. They learnt their trade here, okay? AC/DC are another example of that, who went, right, we've got a shift base. We can't operate from Australia. Because by this time, Neil was living here in Australia, in Melbourne, great house, family, everything set up as exactly as he'd hoped for. But to be big in America, you've got to be prominent in America. You can't just come in and tour a couple of times a year. Keith Urban is a classic example of that. A guy who's just gone, right, I'm shifting base. I'm going to base myself in Nashville in his case, and I'm going to be accessible to America all the time. And, that's a very big thing because the competition is so strong. There's going to be 25 crowded houses, who come in, and if they're not playing, they're going to move into that market.
So maybe, was it a management issue then? More so than you can't blame the band?
Look, it might have, in some ways, I think it was Neil saying, I want a balance of, I want a personal life. I want a home life. I want a family life away from crowded house. I don't want to be on the road 12 months of the year, which is often what it takes, to really break through. It's a common story. The band that records the great album then goes and tours for 2 years. Tom Petty, I guess, being an example of that, someone who toured relentlessly and eventually broke through. It takes a lot of work. Neil had been really lucky and got achieved the success he deserved in America with that first record. But to continue that, you've got to be present. You've got to be on the road all the time. You've got to be on the radio all the time, and he chose not to do that, and which probably worked against him commercially, but he's still married 40 years later. His sons are in the band now. His sons are really accomplished musicians who are in the band with him. And I think by the looks of things and the my understanding of their relationship, Neil's the best dad in the world. He's
awesome.
He's really nailed it down. He really worked it out. So I think he was very conscious of that early on and didn't want to commit himself totally to this thing that was going to drag him away. It's been a bit of a tug of war, admittedly. He still is away. He still would be away 6 months of the year. But I think he just was looking for a way to balance the two. And it's, like I say, it's been successful because, 40 years later, 30 years later, it's a love match. It's great.
Temple of Low Men was #1 in Australia, which says it all. 1991 Woodface. They could
fart in a bottle and release it here, and it'd be #1.
But you mentioned Woodface.
It'd be in tune, though. Don't get me wrong; it'd be in tune.
Tim Finn ends up playing a big role in this album, Woodface, right? Because there were songs that were initially to be a Finn Brothers project, and then they become.
Well, that's and that's a really good story because they, as you say, Temple of Low Men had not achieved the success in America that the label had hoped. And of course, this is the complication of being answerable to an American label, not to an Australian label with an American, a mothership. They were now Capitol owned them. We wanted to sell records. We need you to sell records. So they've gone into making the third record, which became Woodface. And the songs weren't working. The record label wasn't comfortable, wasn't happy with the early songs. So Neil came home and he's like, damn, I've had enough. And Tim's career had been solo career. He'd had that early success, but it was starting to flatline. Some of his solo records really weren't doing that well. Again, popular in Australia and New Zealand, some fans in the UK, but he just hadn't had that commercial success that his first solo record had achieved. And they had always wanted to work together, and this time properly. As you said, with Split Enz, they'd sort of shout song titles at each other and work in separate rooms. Well, this was different. This was two guys for a period of about 2 or 3 weeks. Every morning they'd get in, they'd sit down at the table. What do you got? Oh, I've got an idea for, something called chocolate cake. I've got this idea about something called 4 Seasons in One Day. And all these great songs came together, Weather With You being another example of it. And it was great. It was a great catharsis for Neil. Thank God, the Crowded House drama, I can just put that aside. Working with Tim, and they had no idea what to really do with these songs. But Neil was so excited and so satisfied by the results of this songwriting session with Tim, and then they got and recorded demos as well. He said, Dan, you want to join the band? He thought at the time that was a great idea. And look, you can understand. I mean, they'd written all these great songs and everything felt good again. And he sort of owed his brother one. You can't deny the fact that, Neil had gone on to this great success, and Tim himself had said that when Don't Dream It's Over became this huge hit, he was equally thrilled for his brother and envious. Damn, man, I wanted that. Why didn't Split Enz have that #1 hit in America? And so Neil felt a certain amount of responsibility. Brought him into the band, released Woodface, released Chocolate Cake in America. Well, that was a bad idea. However, on the other side of the world, in the UK, they love this stuff. Suddenly this album is a huge hit. They go on tour and Tim just doesn't fit. You can't have 2 frontmen in a band, particularly when they're brothers. It just didn't work. And for Neil's songs, Tim would be at the back playing the keyboards, tinkering along the keyboards, which is not his natural domain. Anybody who's seen him perform, he's this big, impressive, handsome, flamboyant frontman. And suddenly he's sort of a side man who would occasionally come down the front of the stage to perform his songs with Neil. So it just didn't work. And Neil actually had to fire his big brother.
Well, yeah, but there was a punch.
They
punch thrown.
Well, that's very funny. There's a place here called Byron Bay. I guess try to think of the hate in San Francisco in the 60s, okay? Byron Bay's always sort of tried to model itself on that. It's a place where you can go to get your aura, photographed and have your chakra realigned and, eat mung beans. It doesn't really work, but it's sort of seen as a hippie haven. So they're playing a gig there and it's reached boiling point. Tim's fed up with it. You can tell. Something went on stage, and afterwards Neil took what Tim called a pathetic swing at me. Not sure if he connected, but Neil just went off in a huff, and he's sitting inside the tour van, and he's just thinking, "Oh, this is just bad. It's not working." And this local hippie came up and said something about, "Neil, it's okay. I'll heal you." And he just looked out the window and said, "Fuck off." And within months, Tim was out of the band. But the good coda, the great coda to that story is that Tim's back in Melbourne. Crowded House are back on the road. Mark Hart joined the band. Tim's out. The record's doing great business in the UK. And this is still the 90s. This fax comes through and it says, "Hey, Tim, just letting you know, Weather With You is top 10 in the UK." And he's like, "Man," he said, "one part of me is feeling, damn, I missed. The other part is thinking, look what I've achieved." So, in a lot of ways, I think what Neil had hoped to achieve with those songs was accomplished. But there's a lot of grief. But then afterwards, subsequently, they've worked together many, many times.
Which is great. Yeah. Thankfully.
So I think they've really found a balance. He's certainly not going to bring Tim back into Crowded House again. That was a bad idea. But you could have, I understood the reasoning behind it.
Sure.
There was a lot more than just music,
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. They did release Together Alone after that in 1993. Number 2 in Australia, but that would turn out to be the last Crowded House album of new material to be released for almost 15 years.
Yep.
What led to the end of Crowded House? It seems like it starts with the drummer, Paul Hester. He's kind of burned out. And then there's another post-show moment.
What a drama that was. I mean, they're in the middle of an American tour, and Paul had just had his wife was pregnant with their first child. Neil already had kids. And Paul's, he was this amazing presence on stage, a great drummer and a very, very naturally funny guy. He could have been a stand-up comedian. He was really genuinely funny on stage and off, but fragile too. There was obviously some real deep psychological issues there that probably this is still, like I say, we're still in the 90s. We're not exactly, are you okay? We're not at that stage yet, in modern life. He's reluctantly gone back on the road with the big American tour, dozens and dozens of shows on the road, in motion all the time. And it just fell apart. They got to Atlanta and he just said, "I just can't do it." He said to Neil, and Neil could sense it. Neil wasn't stupid. He could sense that something was up. And Paul said, "I got to go home. I just can't do it anymore." And it's like, well, obviously big drama. We've got a gig tomorrow night. What do we do? And you're such a key part of our band. But I think Neil could understand, while he was really angry about it, he could also understand that, if he carried on any longer, it was going to be to both the detriment of Paul and to the band. They managed to get, I think it was Sheryl Crow's drummer, sat in for him for a few gigs. And then they found a permanent replacement, a guy called Simon Jones, I think his name was, who died, sadly. But
didn't Neil get pushed down didn't Paul push him down a set of stairs? He pushed Neil down a set of stairs after a show?
They were playing in Milan, and the story goes that they just couldn't pull an audience in Milan. For some reason, Italy just didn't work for Crowded House. But there'd be, a faithful, a hardcore kind of faithful who'd be at the backstage after gigs, wanting to get autographs. There's still that kind of core audience. And on this night, after something happened on stage, I can't remember if Paul pushed Neil or Neil pushed Paul. He's tumbled down the stairs and basically fallen into the path of all the fans who were there for an autograph from that lovely band, that lovely fun bunch of guys, Crowded House. So there was the odd flare up, the odd bit of conflict. Not quite, like I say, not quite David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen level, yes. But still.
I love this. Well, like the Eagles, what was the story with Glenn Fry and Don Felder when this is around 79, 80, when Felder was just about out of the band. Actually, the Eagles were just about done. And they had a huge disagreement. So they're playing their last show, and after each song, Glenn Fry was like, when this show's over, I'm going to knock you out. Right, and so after each song, he'd be like, 11 more songs, 10 more songs. Like he did that and sure enough, I think he swung his guitar at Felder after the show. It could get a little high school bandish. Sure.
But the Paul Hester story, of course, like I said, it's the tragedy of Crowded House is that obviously there was something much deeper at work here. It's unfortunately, he took his own life.
Yeah, Paul Hester.
It was such a horror. I mean, people just could not believe it because he became a TV host here. He was hosting.
Right, he had a successful career with that. Okay, and
absolutely. I remember,
so this is 2005, or so from like 90. I think. Well, Neil went solo from 97 forward, up to
they played together occasionally. On these shows. Let's see. Paul was on Music Max. So there's a couple of different shows that Hesse Shed, which was really funny.
Okay.
Because actually the stage setting was like a garden shed with a stage, and he'd bring in all these people. And him, Paul, Nick Seymour, and Neil Finn had played together on these shows.
Okay. So yes, sporadically here and there. Yeah.
It wasn't like Paul was on the outer at all. He owned a cafe in Melbourne. He was doing his own thing. He had a little young family.
Well, that's why people were shocked, though, because he took his dog for a walk. This is in 2005. He's 46 years old at the time. Yeah, took his dog for a walk.
I think it was, like I say, it was just unaddressed issues. The guy obviously had a lot of personal baggage and psychological problems, which probably weren't addressed. I mean, my wife's a psychologist, and she tells me stories about this all the time. Some people just don't want to tackle what's really getting.
Never asked for help, right? Yeah.
Never asked for help. And Neil and Tim were as shocked as anybody else, and they were playing a gig in London at the Albert Hall, and suddenly it became a wake for Paul, and they set up on stage often during crowded house shows, Paul would come to the front of the stage and play a little snare drum and, be a front man. And they had that set up on stage. No one used it during the gig, but it just sat there. That was Paul. So, I think they really handled it really, really as best as they possibly could, as given the shock that they were in. And then eventually Neil got back in the studio, and like I said, he missed that band thing. Right. He really missed that. And I think he came over the years, he's come to understand that that's an integral part of who he is, being in a band, that camaraderie, that kind of brotherhood that is a band beyond the music. It's all the other stuff as well. So he got Crowded House back together. Nick came back in.
2006.
Right? Yeah, and they made Time on Earth was the first record. Yeah. And if you listen to it, it's a lot darker. There's obvious stuff. There's not obvious, there's no song called Paul Is Gone, We Miss Him, but his spirit in that record was really quite pronounced, I think. There's a song called Silent House that Neil co-wrote with Natalie Maines from, I was going to say the Dixie Chicks. You can't say that anymore.
Right.
The Chicks. And it turned out it was about the lyric was about Natalie's grandmother, who had, I think, Alzheimer's. But if you listen, I remember hearing it. I went to a pre-release preview in the studio of that record with Nick and Neil. We're kind of hosting this get together, just 10 of us in a room. I remember asking him about that song. I said, that's the real centerpiece of the record, isn't it? Neil said, yeah. But I didn't realize at the time it was a co-write. I thought it was Neil writing very clearly about, this silent house, this loss, this emptiness that was created by a vacuum that was created by Paul's loss. And I think maybe it is. If you see him play it live, it's a big part of Crowded House's set, and Neil really loses himself in this song. And I think, simply being on stage, being Crowded House stirs up memories of Paul Hester, no doubt about it, because he was such an integral part of that whole thing. But certain songs really bring him to the forefront of Neil's memory. And I think he's handled it really beautifully, because I've not seen a Crowded House show in the last 10, 15 years where he hasn't mentioned Paul Hester.
Really?
Paul always gets a mention. Hell yeah.
That's cool.
He will never, no matter who's playing the drums, whether right now it's Neil's son, Elroy on drums. It doesn't matter. It's still, Paul was the drummer from Crowded House. It will always be.
That's great.
Sort of, always attached to that. And he's handled it really well, as devastating a loss as it is, 20 years later. Neil has said it. It was what was the tragedy of Crowded House and probably my life was losing Paul Hester.
Sure.
Very heavy. Yeah, it was really, and here it was just people just devastated. They just couldn't believe it, because I guess the last big hurrah, and it was quite a few years before, was they played a huge show. When Crowded House said, that's it, we're done, first time round, was 1996, late 1996, and they wanted to play a charity show, a fundraiser, and they decided to do it on the forecourt of the Sydney Opera House, which is just this magnificent setting. I was there just a couple of months ago to see The War on Drugs and Spoon, just one of the best shows I've ever seen, because you've just got this natural, it's almost like a natural amphitheatre, big space, Harbour Bridge, Sydney Harbour, Sydney Opera House. It's a really beautiful spot. So they decided to do this farewell show. And, this is a sign of their popularity here in particular. They thought, well, we'll do a free show, and we'll pass, try to raise some money at the gate and see how it goes. 250,000 people turned
Wow.
up. It was one of the biggest shows ever staged. And the really interesting part is it was supposed to be on a Saturday from memory. It rained. They came out to do sound check, and already there were thousands and thousands of people there. And Neil said, look, I'm sorry. We decided it's just a safety risk. We can't play the show because of the rain. Everybody stayed. Everybody stayed
Wow.
and came back. And even more people came back the next day. So they got 250,000 people to this show. And if you look at this, I think there's some images in the book. It's just a sea of people. It's like Simon and Garfunkel in Central Park. It's that kind of level. And that was Paul's last big hurrah with Crowded House, because he played most of the night as there's their drummer. But there's a great story, and one I like to tell is that, so they played this amazing show, and it's a really big emotional experience for the crowd. People are in tears, my God, Crowded House are breaking up. And, for everybody in the band, it's pretty heavy too. And they go backstage, and, I can't imagine what it would be like to stand in front and, to be, communing with so many people, and then to have to walk off stage into a little dressing room, just the 4 or 5 of you. Be a very weird experience. They get back to the dressing room, and there's some guy, just a dude from the crowd. He's sitting there and he's having a beer.
Huh.
And I'm like, who are you? And he said, I was walking around the back of the stage, because you've got to understand too, it's in a sort of open environment. It's not inside the opera house. It's on the forecourt. And he said, I was just walking around. And I saw a hole in the fence. So I just thought I'd crawl through. And they said, cool. You want another beer? Yeah.
Oh
sure.
my God, that's awesome.
I'd love to track that guy down. He'd have the bragging rights for the rest of his life.
Sure.
I was the guy in the dressing room after the show.
If you're out there, if you're hearing this,
talk about it, bring you back to earth. It's like, oh.
Yeah, if he's listening to this right now, come on.
Yeah, we know who we want to know.
We want to hear from him. Yeah, so let's get to the Fleetwood Mac story, because Crowd House pretty much right up and through 2021, very active, releasing albums and touring. But then comes the gig with this little band called Fleetwood Mac. He and Tom Petty guitarist Mike Campbell, they joined the band. Oh, actually 2018. I'm sorry, I got the year.
What had happened was Mick Fleetwood was in New Zealand with Fleetwood Mac. I think this is around 2015. And Neil, you go to New Zealand, and if you're a musician, you want to meet Neil Finn, right? And also Neil has one of the leading studios in Auckland called, I keep getting it wrong. It's either Roundhead or Roundhouse Studio. And people, Wilco have recorded there, Radiohead have recorded there. It's a really great studio. And also he's a great host. You come to New Zealand, there's a good chance Neil Finn's going to catch up with you and take you back to one of his very many palatial houses in New Zealand. And him and Mick met at an award show, and they just struck up a friendship.
Yeah, it was like in 1999, I think, according to your book.
It was before then, yeah. And I don't think Mick was really, I think he admitted, I don't really know your work that well, but I've heard of Split Enz and I've heard of Crowded House. And it was a friendship first and foremost. And then they caught up a few more times. And then this drama happened with Lindsey Buckingham. I'm not going to go on tour. I think he had his own solo record. So Mick stuck, what do I do? Do I keep the band rolling? And in typical Fleetwood Mac fashion, it's like, oh, screw it, get someone else. It had happened before.
It's been done before. Yeah.
But, the fact that he needed 2 great musicians to fill the boots of one is, it's a testimony to Lindsey Buckingham, but that's another story. So he calls Neil, and Neil was as surprised as anybody. It's like, you want me to join Fleetwood Mac?
Yeah, just like his brother calling all those years ago. It's the phone
exactly,
call.
Exactly. And I remember I think he put out a tweet saying, it was really funny. He said, the mysteries of Stonehenge have been resolved. Oh, and I've joined Fleetwood Mac. It's like this really bizarre tweet. And people are like, what? You've done what? You're an original musician. You're joining someone else's band. But, they didn't understand the nature of this friendship that he had with Mick. And also, a couple of things. Money. The money would be out freak. My understanding is he bought a house in LA on the proceeds of the touring alone. Okay, so serious money. Okay?
And he gets pulled over by a cop.
It's true. Got pulled over by a cop in LA somewhere, and he didn't have an American driver's license, and he showed his New Zealand one. He said, "Oh, by the way, I'm in Fleetwood Mac." It's like, oh, okay, you're cool. Yeah.
Isn't that? Oh man, there you go. He's finally made it in the U.S. That's
yeah. I guess, and I hadn't thought about that too. You're right. He's now playing to the audiences, 50, 60,000 people a night that he sort of hoped for, that Neil had hoped for with Crowded House. Never quite got there. But as I said earlier too, as a real nod to Neil's musicianship, the respect that other musicians hold, in which they hold him, is that every night Mick would give him a solo spot.
Yeah.
Play Don't Dream It's Over. I think he did, he would do Landslide with Stevie Nicks as a sort of two-person, like almost like a duet. And then some nights they do, some nights they'd also do I Got You. So,
and they I don't know if it's Neil's doing, but the set list, they got like Bob Welch era songs and Danny Kerwin era Mac songs. They did mix it up a bit, didn't they? Yeah. You're right. Yeah, that's got to be. It's got to have to do with him and or Mike Campbell, I would think.
Yeah,
or maybe
it was amazing. I think just if you listen to something, watch some of the footage of those shows. Initially, there's sort of who's this dude, and then you start that campfire strum that I told you about, and people go, "Oh, he's that guy.
Yep,
that's his song, right?" And I think Mick would introduce it as every lifetime a song comes along that really captures and defines a moment or something to that effect. So he had the people listening clearly. The audience were really getting inside what was about to happen. And, once Neil would come on, it would happen every night, and it was a big part of the show.
What do you think? Do you want to see him record a studio album? Didn't they recorded a song? I saw it on Spotify.
Neil recorded a song with Christine McVie and Stevie Nicks. It was, again, a charity fundraiser that he did here. Did in New Zealand. So they'd worked with him, and I think he's done something with Mick. I don't know about. I mean, the Fleetwood Mac thing, of course, with the sad death of Christine McVie, is sort of.
Yeah,
I don't know what the situation is there.
Though, it'd be really cool just to see them collaborate. See what you got Mike Campbell, who's a great songwriter too. Boys of Summer, Don Henley. He's a songwriter too. I'd love to have them all get together and put.
In fact, I think I'd just like a Neil Mike Campbell record. Now that I think about it.
Sure. Yeah. Why
maybe
not?
It was for Stevie Nicks vocals. That'd work.
Yeah.
There you go.
Why not?
A splinter band. They could form their own trio. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like I said, and here there was a lot of confusion about it. It's like, he's joined what? He's joined Fleetwood Mac. What the hell's going on? But as I said, it all dates back to this personal relationship that he had with Mick Fleetwood. And, it's evolved and it worked really, really well. The shows were really wonderfully well received, and it proved to be unintentionally a wonderful final hurrah for Christine McVie as well.
Yeah. So the book is out now. Don't Dream It's Over, The Remarkable Life of Neil Finn. Hardcover, paperback, and Kindle formats, right? All three?
You name it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So find it wherever books are sold. And then where can people find you online? You have your own website.
Just find me, Jeff Apter, with Jeff with a J. Apter, that's chapter without the CH. Come on, this all makes perfect sense. What do they call that? Nominative determinism.
Yeah.
JeffApter.com.au. You'll find all my work there. You can contact me. I welcome, abuse as long as it's, I don't mind abuse as long as the spelling's good.
There you go.
Very important. Grammar matters to me, okay?
The grammar check.
If you're going to have a shot at me, at least do it properly. But if people can't have trouble tracking down my books, drop me a line. Or if there's anything else in my back catalogue they're interested in, hey, I'm here. I've got a reasonable stash here on the bookshelf. Yeah,
if you're an AC/DC fan, you're the guy to go to. You got some great AC/DC books, a lot of books. So that's great, Jeff. So looking forward to having you back on again whenever.
I'm here for you, Eric. It's good to talk. Like I said, my second coming. I'm Phil honored.
We'll see. When will the third visit be? You got to write a book just so you can come on. That's
always something in the works, man. Trust me.
All right, Jeff Apter, thanks so much.
Thanks, Eric. That was great. Good to talk to you again, man.
That's it. It's in the books.